Okay, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about what are the goals of macroeconomic policy and what do we look at to see if an economy is performing well or not well. So to start, macroeconomics again focuses on the economy as a whole, or on whole economies as they interact between one another. So we'll be concerned about things like recessions. What is a recession? What causes a recession? How do we pull ourselves out of a recession? Also, we're concerned with questions like unemployment. What causes unemployment? Why can it stay high? How do we decrease unemployment eventually? Why does unemployment stay high when recessions are supposed to be over? Sometimes we have economies that are growing pretty well, but we still have unemployment. What's going on and why is that the case? Why do some countries grow faster than others in terms of their productive output? Why do we see countries with 6-7% growth and others with 1% growth? And is that good or bad? Again, these are more normative questions, but if we wanted to increase the growth of a country, how could we do it? And what's the relationship between a country that has a high standard of living and another one? And is there a relationship between that and GDP, for example? So I've used a lot of words here, so let's dive into some of these words. Bear in mind also that we'll talk about macroeconomic policy later on in the course and how we can use policy to improve the performance of the economy. But first we need to measure performance before we can improve it. We need to know, is it doing well or isn't it doing well? So some of the measures we're trying to get to when we undertake policy is some benchmark levels. For example, economic growth. Economic growth helps determine standard of living in an economy, and we usually expect that an economy grows or should grow around 3% per year. If an economy is growing less than 3% or more, we could have some negative effects. A high growth rate could result in inflation, and low growth probably results in undue or a higher level of unemployment. Unemployment is also a goal of policy. A lot of economies like having a low level of unemployment. Obviously, unemployment meaning the people that want to work but can't. They can't find a job. And we'll learn more about how we measure unemployment in later chapters. It's measured by the unemployment rate, again. And oftentimes we'd like to achieve an unemployment rate of about 5% when the economy is going along at its normal pace. Sometimes it'll be above that when the economy enters a recession. Sometimes it'll be below that when we're maybe growing too fast in our economy. And the other goal of policy would be inflation. Inflation is the increase of prices year on year, from one year to the next. It's measured by the consumer price index. And again, we'll take a look at what is inflation, how it's measured in other videos. So economists are normally looking at an inflation rate of about 1 to 2%. It's pretty rare to see inflation go to 0. It's even very, very rare to ever see something like that. Yeah, an economy as it grows, usually you can expect prices to grow as well in the economy, and having some inflation is totally normal. So these are typical goals. So if we take a look at, for example, the French economy, so I live and work in France, and so we can track the French economy relative to other economies. And here you see, for example, the growth. Now this data is coming from the Google Public Data Explorer, and if you're ever looking for a nice place to find macroeconomic data, you can go to Google and look at the Public Data Explorer to find GDP, for example. So here we've got the percentage change in gross domestic product. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And this is basically the total production of goods and services in an economy is GDP. And we can see that the amount produced for France is the red line. We had high levels of growth in the 80s. We went down to some lower levels of growth, and it went back up, and then it went down big time in 2008. And this was the recession from the financial crisis we had in 2008, late 2008, 2009, and then we're back up. But what we do see is that France's growth rate doesn't exceed very often 4%, and it hovers. Sometimes we get a negative growth. So we're obviously in a recessionary period, and here as well, when we have negative growth rates. But usually it's in this band between 0 and 3%. We don't have a high growth. And most of the time, a lot of times, the French economy is between 0 and 2% growth. If we compare it to other countries, the United States tracks the growth rate of GDP pretty well for that of France. A country that grows very well, very, very high, is going to be China, for example, where we have a growth rate easily above 6% per year, which is a very high rate of growth of GDP. Unemployment is also something we like to track. Again, this is the measure of the number of people that aren't working that want to work, basically. They are looking for a job and they can't work. And unemployment is typically a part of being in a recession. But not always. I mean, you don't need to be in a recession. And here you can see that France's unemployment rate has hovered well above 7%. But what's interesting with this unemployment rate for France in this band is that we know that the economy of France was in a recession, for example, in 2008, 2009. So we see a lagged effect here. But it wasn't always in a recession. And in fact, we had some growth periods. And yet, unemployment still remained pretty high, around 7%. So what we'll discover is that unemployment can be due to ups and downs of business cycles when we go into a recession or we come out of a recession, but they're also due to other reasons, what's called structural unemployment. And it looks like statistics tell us that France probably has a high level of what's called structural unemployment. As the economy moves in and out of the business cycle, this doesn't go away. We still have a certain level of unemployment that's pretty high. You don't see that in other economies. You can see that during performing years, you can see the UK level went down and went back up. Germany, again, fluctuating between relatively low levels here, some high levels here. But France's band is pretty narrow, and that's a cause for concern. Inflation, if we look at inflation comparing the UK, Germany, and France, we also see that inflation is pretty much under control. Now, what's interesting is that inflation, low levels of inflation is one of the primary targets of the European Central Bank. And their primary goal, amongst others, is keeping inflation low. Other central banks, like in the United States, have other goals, growth, unemployment, and things like that. But the European Central Bank basically targets keeping inflation very, very low. And that's why we have inflation rates almost 0%, around 1% inflation in France today. And that's good and bad. Prices are not rising, but prices not rising and inflation being low is often an indicator that the economy is not growing as fast as it could be. So that's having low inflation maybe not be a great sign. Having low inflation is good, because if prices are rising too fast, then inflation, we have issues with wages not keeping up with inflation and cost of living rising. So the value of our income goes down as prices rise in general. So there's good and bad. Another interesting point here is savings. Saving is also something we track. Saving is relatively high in the French economy. Households save quite a lot of money relative to other economies. And we know that some economies, for example, the U.S. economy is a consumer-based society with savings rates very, very low relative to GDP. And in France, much higher. And that's good and bad. I mean, it's bad in some respects because people aren't buying, and consumption is a key driver of an economy. It's good because savers are people that are putting money aside in case something bad happens, like, well, the coronavirus. And the economy is a little bit more resilient in situations like that. Plus, also, savings is a way to make money available for business investors. If people aren't saving money, then, well, there's no money to be borrowed by companies. France, of course, is within the European Union and part of the common currency, the euro. And because of this, they are a member of the Treaty on Stability, Coordination, and Governance. And this is a fiscal compact that members of the EU try to enforce. And it limits the size of the deficit of a government. So this would be the amount of expenditures relative to revenue by the government. So governments make tax revenue, and then they spend that money. And the difference between what it earns and what it spends is the deficit. And in France and in all European countries, the size of the deficit we'd like it to be around 0.5% of GDP, so 0.5% of total production and value. Member states can run excessive budget deficits that can be pretty high, up to 3% of GDP. And debt, which is money we've borrowed and we owe, above 60% of GDP. And if we're up around 3%, we're in excess. We're kind of in the high end. And if we go to this, then there's a bunch of rules that the European Union enforces. So where is France? I mean, is our deficit around 0.5, or are we closer to 3% of GDP? And where's our debt? Are we above 60% of GDP, total production in terms of debt? Well, we're not doing that well. France, if we look at France from 2018 to 2019, as we said, the growth rates are pretty low. We have a very low rate of inflation, around 1.3%, and it's expected to stay that way. Unemployment is very high for an economy with a low inflation rate, and this is a cause for concern for a lot of economists. Why is unemployment remain high when the economy's doing okay, 1.3% growth? It could be a little bit higher, but 8.5% is relatively high, and this is a cause for concern. And as you can see here, the budget deficit is about 3%, so we're really at the top limit in France. And after the coronavirus issues in 2020, we're going to expect this to be even above 3%. The gross public debt, what the government owes, they've borrowed money to finance previous deficits, and they have to pay that money back to the people they've borrowed the money from. This is telling us that about, if you take the entire year's worth of production in an economy, it basically will just pay back what the government owes. We're almost at 100% of annual GDP is as public debt, which is huge. And yet there are some economies where it's even higher. So we can see that that's a cause for concern. Now, if you want to track these numbers, and I do suggest you do track these numbers, as any good manager will do. One great place to do it, if you're in Europe, is the Eurostat website, and you can look at a lot of great data on this website and follow some key indicators like GDP and whatnot. As you can see, Eurostat provides easy access to a lot of very useful data about unemployment. You can track it for the entire European Union. You can look into specific countries and track changes of that from one year to the next. We can look at rates of inflation, GDP, production, government deficits and surpluses, a whole bunch of very, very useful information at your fingertips via the Eurostat website. Another useful website to track a lot of these indicators is the OECD. So the OECD provides a lot of data that goes way beyond Europe. So let's take a quick look. So the OECD provides information by country and goes way beyond basic economics. I mean, you have information the population, you have tax revenues, you have tax CO2 emissions, unemployment, equity issues, education issues, what are the levels of education, performance on test, energy production, energy independence, road accidents. OECD data is quite impressive. It's a little more complex to manage and follow, but it's a great website to gather data. So as you manage and track your macroeconomic goals, I strongly suggest you use places like the OECD and like Eurostat to collect information. Okay, that's it for me. Good luck for everybody out there, and talk to you next time.